trilogies are a funny thing. Most people want more of things they love. Hollywood especially tends to just constantly give us more and more and more, but without proper direction and creativity, and also the need to change things up rather than keeping the same tried and tested formula. It's generally quite hard to come across a great trilogy in all formats that is consistent without any weak links. You can have incredible movie trilogies like Lord of the Rings, but you can also have awful movie trilogies like The Hobbit. You can have great trilogies like the original Star Wars trilogy, and then you can have awful ones like the sequel trilogy. What tends to happen though is that the first or the second one are amazing or very successful, and then by the time it gets to the third one, the third one is usually pretty poor. People have got tired of it by then. So a great example of this is the Matrix trilogy. You have the first one, which was groundbreaking, ahead of its time, jaw-dropping. The second one, which was still pretty good, and in retrospect, it's probably better than it deserved. And then by the time the third one came around, I think people had just got tired of it. It changed. It wasn't people treated it like it was going to be an action movie, but it wasn't. It was a philosophy movie, and so it just did really, really badly. Personally, I think the Matrix trilogy is really, really good. Each movie has its own unique personality, but in terms of box office, it definitely tailed off towards the end. So what I would say is the trilogy or Golden Trilogy is one where it's quite hard to pick the best one out of the three, or even if you can, it's not actually saying that the one that isn't the best is bad. It's just saying that the other ones are better and these ones are still good. So with that in mind, here's our top 8 video game trilogies of all time.
Starting at number 8 here, we have the Dark Souls trilogy, which I think a lot of people in the comments will agree with. I think the game series started really, really strong with Dark Souls 1. Obviously, they sort of had Demon Souls to work off the groundwork, but Dark Souls 1 was definitely the sort of big start for this series. Dark Souls 2 was definitely a bit of a step back, but then finally with Dark Souls 3, it was a very, very strong contender for Dark Souls 1's spot. So again, sort of like you said, it's a trilogy where you can sort of point out perhaps the weakest in the trilogy, but it's not like any of them really, really hold it back from being a fantastic sort of package as a whole. And I personally can't really decide which one I like more between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, which definitely keeps the trilogy really, really strong as a whole.
Yeah, and look, I've just started playing through them, but I've heard a lot, and from what I can gather, there are some people with personal preferences, but there isn't like a general rule where, when you look at YouTube videos and people's comments, you don't get this overriding sense that everyone likes one over the other two. Everyone has their own personal preference, it looks like to me. And with that, let's jump straight into number 7 on this list. This would be the Batman Arkham series. A few reasons why this has been included really is that they are good games. They kind of redefined the kind of superhero genre games in that they had their own story. They had iconic characters, iconic voice actors. I mean, Mark Hamill as the Joker, for example, is just golden. Possibly the best portrayal of a Joker, including Heath Ledger's portrayal. Again, don't at me. But that's my just personal preference. I thought he was great. Pretty decent stories. Everything gets included. Gameplay is pretty repetitive, but pretty easy to get into. Combat wise, it makes sense and it works. How can you pick a favorite one? I mean, I know I can't. Another game that I've played through again recently due to the remastering or the releases on PS4 as well. But honestly, I can't pick a best one out of those 3. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely very difficult to pick one that just stands above the others. I think all of them sort of bring something new to the table each time. It never, of course, it's a little bit repetitive in terms of gameplay, but they all feel worth playing in their own respective right. So 100%. And yet, moving on to number 6 on the list here, we have the Assassin's Creed Ezio collection, which I think is almost completely unarguable here. Easily sort of the peak of the Assassin's Creed franchise as a whole. And the reason why we've included this as a trilogy, by the way, is because it's sort of being packaged as a trilogy. Obviously, there was Assassin's Creed 1 and all the games that came subsequently, but the Ezio collection is being marketed as its own sort of separate trilogy, as it were. So we definitely want to include this one because honestly, though I think a lot of people, like, there is sort of a general consensus that Brotherhood is the best one, I definitely find it really, really enjoyable to play through every single one of the games in this trilogy. So that includes obviously Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood, and Assassin's Creed Revelations, which is personally one of my favorite games in the series.
Yeah, well, look, from my perspective, I never finished Brotherhood first time round. I'm also in the midst of going through them all again, so I hope to finish it this time. But Revelations for me was like, it's the perfect containing of two stories, so not just Ezio's, but also Altair's, which was, I think, a really, really underrated storyline as well by a lot of Assassin's Creed fans. But yeah, so those three are probably the peak of the Assassin's Creed series, and whilst the series may have had some questionable entries since then, it is hard to pick the best one of those three, in my opinion, which is why it's made the list. So next up, at number 5, we have the Fable trilogy. It does go down as a trilogy. It is probably one of those that the first one, TLC / anniversary, depending on when you played it, does probably carry this series a little bit more than it should. So it is one of the few where there is one that is a pick of the bunch. However, I think that first one is so good, and the goodwill created from that led into the next two, which had these big ideas and these big kind of ambitions, and they came in with some great voice acting talent. Stephen Fry, John Cleese, amongst more. That it was disappointing, but they were actually still objectively, I think, good games. Fable 2, the only real issue for me was probably the ending. The ending being, something that was a bit arbitrary, and actually, if you didn't choice quick enough, it was made for you, which kind of sucked. But apart from that, actually, they were not that bad. What's your take on this trilogy being on the list?
I mean, as our sort of definition goes, like, each game sort of has to add something, and definitely, the addition of even just the dog in Fable 2 is borderline revolutionary in Fable. So definitely, like, you're not going to get the same experience playing through each game. They're definitely they all bring something new to the table, which is exactly what you want for a trilogy. And I think even though they've gotten a pretty bad public rap, I think Fable 1 and 2 especially sort of keep this trilogy afloat. I definitely think Fable 3 is probably the weakest of the bunch, but it's still got more than enough substance and more than enough sort of updates in comparison to Fable 1 and 2 that it's still worth playing, even if perhaps the story or the ending is a little bit lackluster. And I guess with that, I'll move straight on to number 4 on the list here, which is the Gears of War trilogy, and this is sort of specifically the Marcus Phoenix storyline, following him sort of leading his coalition against the Locust Horde, and this sort of continues a conflict throughout all 3 games in this series. So just, ignoring gameplay entirely, if we just talk about story, it's got a sort of continuation between the 3 in a similar way to a lot of the other games on this list, where you can't really play any one without the others, as you're sort of missing out on the continuation of the story. But then if we do talk about gameplay at the end, definitely some of the most fun shooters out there. I mean, there's absolutely nothing that sort of matches your ability to just go from one cover to another and then eventually get up to your sort of locust enemy and just chainsaw them in half with your chainsaw gun. Cannot complain.
Yeah, 100%. And look, there's 4 difficulty settings that you can play the game through on, and all of them have value. I think I've played through all 3 games on all 4 difficulty settings at least once. And whilst, like Insane and Hardcore, the top 2, are super difficult and definitely a challenge, there is something about speed running through on the kind of casual level, where you have these bigger locust enemies like boomers that you could just run straight up, not okay boomer, just boomers, and you could just run up to them instead of hiding and covering and taking lots of bullets. If you have a shotgun or whatever, you can just try and melee attack them and get through it pretty quickly, which is also fun in its own right. it's just great. It absolutely changed the game, really. I mean, I had an Xbox, the original Xbox, and a PS2, and when the Xbox 360 and the PS3 came out originally, what swayed me towards the 360, honest to God, was the original Gears of War game. So yeah, fantastic game series, and I think still worth the replay value. The first couple, the graphics are a little bit dated, but still work because of the palette of colors and everything else. A hell of a lot of good fun. So with that, number 3, the original Halo trilogy. So that is obviously Halo, Halo 2, and Halo 3. I think all of which have also been remastered. Have they? Am I right with that one? At least.
Yeah, they've recently been added to PC again in the Master Chief Collection as well. So just in case this list is sort of swaying you to pick up any of these games, you can get the Halo Master Chief Collection on Steam now.
Yeah, I mean, look, and this is our top 3, and I think it really gets to a level here above and beyond. And for me, like the first 3 Halo games, they're still my favorites personally. They really like just ridiculously iconic. I can't pick the best one or the worst one out of them. I think obviously the first one has a special place in my heart, but the second one as well. You know, from the moment where you dual wield your SMGs type thing, and also using the energy sword for the first time as Arbiter. Then also the third one, you know, just culminating that storyline just amazingly well. Graphically, they look good at the time. They look good now. You know, the like having Cortana, the music, everything. It's just, I still get chills listening to the music these days.
Yeah, honestly, Halo has something about it that I don't really think other shooters have managed to replicate, and I guess it's maybe just due to personal bias. I really love sort of the sci-fi and the sort of setting that they have there, but also I genuinely just think that Halo as a series, but specifically the first 3, just consistently added on top of what was already there, exactly what you would want. You know, you go from Halo 1, where you know the energy sword exists, but you couldn't really use it, to Halo 2, where you finally get to have it in your hand, and it just feels so good as a gamer to get access to that. And also just the dual wielding, which definitely needs to make a return, I think. Just it's so much fun, and as you said, yeah, the soundtrack is definitely on another level. It's very difficult to name a more iconic track from a video game.
Yeah, and also just a brief comment on side. This is probably, Halo 2 especially, was the game that probably changed the whole playing field when it came to online co-op and, you know, multiplayer modes. I know that it's the one that I probably in my life have played the most online of out of any game still to this day. Super fun, some great modes online, and some yeah, I guess just awesome stuff. And I think that in a way it also has partly contributed to some of the downfall and negative things we've seen in gaming since then. That's another video.
Yep, so with that we'll move on to our number 2 pick, which is the Witcher trilogy, and I think it's definitely the fact that this is not landing at number 1 might be raising some eyebrows, but to be fair, the number 1 slot is taken by a very good pick as well, so we'll get there when we get there. But so notable things about the Witcher trilogy, definitely The Witcher 3 and The Witcher 2 kind of hard carry. I think we've both sort of come to the agreement that Witcher 1 it's a little bit unplayable now, personally. I think it still holds a really great story, but I think it's due a full remake of some kind, maybe, or some sort of remaster, because it definitely lets the series down now, in terms of gameplay and in terms of graphics for sure. But The Witcher 2 definitely is where the series started to pick up really strongly. And it's definitely a contender to one of my favorite RPGs of all time. But then you get to The Witcher 3, which is definitely my favorite RPG of all time. So you've got a really strong trilogy here with a coherent story between the 3 games, and just so many references to the books as well. So you've just got a really great sort of lore to work with as well. And I think CD Projekt Red really knew what they were doing when they were coming into this trilogy. It was definitely intended to be a trilogy from the start. It was never I don't think it was just they released a new one because they had success. It was because they already had a plan sort of set in place.
100%. And look, I think Witcher 3, along with its 2 DLC packs, probably could be considered a trilogy in its own right.
Yeah.
The length. So I would definitely say that 3, 2 and especially 3 do carry this. So again, it's another one that sort of breaks from that mold in terms of 3 that are hard to pick the best one out of. But it's just such is the quality of 2 and 3 that you can't leave it out of a list like this. And I think even 3 by itself, along with the DLC packs, probably rivals almost any trilogy ever made in terms of replay value and just everything really. So it's just, you'll find this a lot with our channel. If you're into these lists, there'll usually be some kind of reference to this game or these games at some point. It's something that's really close to both of our hearts, and I just couldn't make a list without having it in there. So I guess before we get to number 1, shall we have some honourable mentions?
Yep, so I guess the first one that I guess I feel like we should mention is the Uncharted series. Started as a trilogy, but it's definitely expanded sort of beyond that now. But the first 3 especially were really, really, really fun. I guess the only real reason that it hasn't made it onto the list for me personally is that they're sort of they're not quite as coherent as some of the other entries on this list. The stories are a little bit more separated, I suppose, so you could sort of pick up on any of the 3 in the trilogy in any order and you'd probably be fine. And I guess also I think it's sort of become public knowledge now, but the sort of gameplay loop in Uncharted definitely has gotten a little bit stale in the current climate for games. What do you think?
Yeah, so it was definitely worth the mention. They're definitely fun games nonetheless, but what it was, I guess, originally sold as was like a modernized version of, say, a Tomb Raider style, where you're kind of going through, exploring, finding old artifacts and general stuff like that. However, the key difference between, and I was going to include the original Tomb Raider games, so there's another quick honourable mention there. But for me, it just was a bit spoon-fed in parts. Like, you know, if you're standing in a room for too long, it will kind of just reveal the secret to you, and it's kind of a bit, obviously these days people's attention span is less, but like the original Tomb Raiders never did that. Like, if you were stuck in that room, you were stuck in that room until you found out, or, you know, went to the guide magazine and found out for yourself. But yeah, like, it's worth a mention nonetheless. Another one that's worth a mention is probably the original Resident Evil trilogy. Again, I haven't played any of the remastered versions, but I played the originals back in the day on PS1. Really, really fun game, survival horror, great story, spawned a semi-serviceable movie series as well. You know, which has spawned 7 movies now, I think.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, which is
way too many.
Yeah, well, when you think about the actual quality of them, which is not that much, like not that great, like the fact that it's still going, says something about the source material, which is great. So yeah, definitely worth a mention there as well. And then next honourable mention from you.
Yeah, so the next one that we have here is the GTA series, but specifically the first sort of 3D games. So we've got number Vice City, San Andreas, and obviously number 3, the original. So I guess GTA, a little bit of a rough one here, because some of them definitely stand out a lot more than others, but I think Vice City and San Andreas are really, really sort of obvious ones here that a lot of people, especially the fans of the series, have loved ever since they came out, so sort of deserve to be talked about here.
Yeah, well, GTA and Rockstar themselves actually break up their Grand Theft Auto games into like groups. So you've got the original like bird's eye 2D universe games, then you've got this 3D universe. So yeah, GTA 3, Vice City, San Andreas, which are really my wheelhouse in terms of my GTA games, if you like. Really, really high quality. I don't think they've bested them in terms of feel, characters, and everything else actually since. But yeah, really, really good games. The ones that we have since then haven't actually had a complete trilogy, and that would be obviously 4, 5, and whatever's coming next. That would be the what do they call that one? I guess the next gen trilogy, whatever you want to call it. But that's not complete yet, so we can't actually add that one at all. Otherwise, it would be. I guess for me, the next honourable mention I want to put in is probably a controversial one, but it's the Spider-Man film license games, PS2, original Xbox era. So that would be the game, movie games of 1, 2, and Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3. 3 probably less so, but it's really for 2 that one's in there for, because it was the first game that gave us an open world Spider-Man game, like a sandbox, and being a massive Spider-Man fan, I have to say my gaming world was turned upside down ever since being able to be Spider-Man in New York, going wherever I wanted. Pretty cool.
Yeah, and I guess sort of the final honourable mention that I can think of here is the original Tekken games, so Tekken 1, 2, and 3. Personal favourite of mine, I really, really love Tekken, all of the games in the series, but specifically these first 3 have a really, really sort of connected story, following sort of Kazuya and Heihachi, and then eventually Jin. So, I mean, I think it's pretty hard to argue. I think any Tekken fan or even fighting game fan can sort of agree that these first 3 are a really sort of good example of what a trilogy could be, sort of the perfect example of each game sort of getting better as it goes along.
And also before the story got too overly convoluted as well, as in the Mishima story. Like
tends to happen a lot in fighting games, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Just to keep releases coming out, they have to keep obviously doing that and bringing characters back. But yes, this one, especially the first 2, probably the third one a little bit too, which was introducing these good characters with some intrigue and kind of doing it well. And then yeah, since then there's been some good entries in terms of the list, but story-wise, just a little bit offbeat. Yeah, look, that's it for honourables. So let's get straight to our top pick. And I think anyone that knows us will have no surprises. You want to reveal?
Yep. So our number 1 pick is the Mass Effect trilogy, and I think anyone who saw that the Witcher series got put at 2 must have known that Mass Effect was going to get put at 1. It was sort of always a debate between these 2 going at 1 or 2, and we've decided that Mass Effect as a trilogy as a whole kind of just edges it out. I think there's, we may have our favorite in the series, but there really is no one game that absolutely completely overshadows the rest. Every single game adds really, really key moments and sort of important story beats to the overall sort of arc of Shepard, and I think anyone can agree that this is probably the best trilogy in gaming.
Yeah, absolutely. It has all kind of facets that we want. So for me, you had Halo, which had this sci-fi, first-person shooter style, which really set the bar. Then you kind of had Gears of War, which was a bit more third-person, over the shoulder with some cover, but it was also that kind of sci-fi shoot 'em up kind of game. And for me, Gears of War took the combat of Halo and improved on the actual combat and took it to a new level. And then you had Mass Effect, which kind of ticked every box that I wanted ticked. It was RPG. It was character building. It was this amazing big story, and I think probably the best world creation of games. I would pick this as my favorite game universe by a long shot. But I think it had the combat with the cover system, which only came in from Mass Effect 2, to be fair. But it had the RPG, it had the futuristic style, it had all the right elements, it had the sound, it had everything. And 2 for me is probably the only game that you can play standalone out of the trilogy. The other 2 you probably have to play as part of a trilogy, but your enjoyment of 2 might be affected also by what you do in other games. So choices that you make in game 1 might come up to bite you on the backside or to reward you, for example, in game 3 even, and you don't even see what happens with it in game 2. So it's quite impressive. These choices. Yeah. It was BioWare at their absolute prime. There's make no bones about it. They were great at making these sort of choices and things that would actually affect the in-game world and in-game characters. And I've still to this day never played a game that's made me quite so emotional to have a teammate or say a friend in the game die. Right? It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and again, I think it's one of those games as well that across the entire series, although you're sort of following Shepard's story, the story arcs of the supporting cast is also almost as important, and still really impactful. You have returning characters from game 1 coming back in game 2 and game 3, and it's genuinely just that sense of sort of scale where everything you do really does come back in one way or another. And I think Mass Effect kind of sets the bar, not only for what trilogies should sort of aim to be, but also what sort of RPGs with big choices should aim to sort of end up like. And I think the only downside is obviously that Mass Effect 3 ending, which is a little bit sus, but overall definitely the best trilogy on our list here.
Yeah, and so that's our list. Anything that you would like to have seen on the list, anything you think deserves a spot, let us know. And as usual, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you in the next video, guys.